The human mind, in its relentless pursuit of perfection, often becomes its own greatest enemy. This truth would prove more catastrophic than any military campaign, more devastating than any natural disaster, and more final than any cosmic event previously recorded in galactic history. The story that follows is not merely an account of what transpired during the Great Convergence of 2847, but a testament to how one individual's struggle with their own perceived weakness would ultimately determine the fate of billions across 7 galaxies. Dr. Elena Vasquez stood before the quantum consciousness interface, her reflection distorted in the polished chrome surface of humanity's greatest technological achievement. The facility hummed around her with the quiet efficiency of a machine designed to reshape reality itself. Earth's orbital station Prometheus floated in the void between Mars and Jupiter, a testament to human ingenuity that had taken 3 centuries to construct. The station's primary purpose was singular and unprecedented: to create a bridge between human consciousness and the fundamental forces of the universe itself. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she initiated the pre-sequence diagnostics. She had spent the last 15 years of her life preparing for this moment, pushing herself beyond what most considered humanly possible. Her colleagues often remarked on her relentless pursuit of perfection, her inability to accept even the smallest flaw in her work. They didn't understand that every mistake, every imperfection, every moment of weakness she had ever displayed haunted her with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The Convergence Project had been humanity's response to the discovery that consciousness itself was not merely a biological phenomenon, but a fundamental force of the universe, capable of manipulating matter and energy at the quantum level. The technology Elena had helped develop would allow a single human mind to interface directly with the cosmic web that connected all matter and energy across the known galaxies. The applications were limitless: instantaneous communication across vast distances, the ability to manipulate matter at the atomic level, and, perhaps most importantly, the power to prevent the heat death of the universe itself. Elena's personal journey to this moment had been marked by a series of perceived failures that had shaped her into someone who could not tolerate weakness in any form. As a child, she had failed to save her younger brother from a house fire, arriving moments too late with help. In graduate school, a calculation error had led to the destruction of a prototype that had taken her team 3 years to build. During her early career, a moment of hesitation during a critical experiment had resulted in the loss of funding for her entire research division, costing dozens of colleagues their positions. Each failure had carved away at her until she had rebuilt herself into something harder, more precise, more ruthlessly efficient. She had eliminated every trace of what she perceived as weakness from her personality, her methods, and her approach to problem solving. Her colleagues respected her, but they also feared her. She had become a person who demanded perfection not only from herself but from everyone around her, creating an environment where innovation thrived but human connection withered. The quantum consciousness interface represented the culmination of her life's work. Unlike previous attempts to bridge human consciousness with quantum fields, Elena's design incorporated a feedback loop that would allow the operator's mind to actually reshape its own neural pathways in real time, eliminating inefficiencies and optimizing cognitive function during the interface process. It was a system designed by someone who had never learned to accept limitation, never learned to work with imperfection, never learned that sometimes the flaws in a system could be its greatest strength. As Elena began the initialization sequence, monitoring systems across 7 galaxies registered subtle fluctuations in the quantum field networks that connected all matter and energy. The Andromeda Research Collective had been tracking similar experiments across their territory, noting how each attempt to create a consciousness quantum interface had resulted in increasingly complex field disturbances. The Magellanic Cloud Observatory had detected patterns suggesting that these experiments were somehow synchronized, as if the universe itself was preparing for something unprecedented. Elena's consciousness began its descent into the quantum realm, her awareness expanding beyond the confines of her physical brain to encompass the vast network of energy that permeated everything. She could feel the thoughts of every living being within 1,000 light-years, sense the movement of every particle of matter, perceive the flow of time itself as a tangible force that could be manipulated and directed. For the first time in her life, she experienced what it meant to be truly powerful, to be beyond the limitations that had defined her existence. But power without wisdom, strength without acceptance of limitation, perfection without understanding of imperfection's role and balance, these things create not transcendence, but catastrophe. As Elena's consciousness expanded, it began to impose its own rigid parameters on the quantum fields it touched. She had spent so many years eliminating weakness from herself that she began to eliminate what she perceived as imperfections in the universal quantum structure itself. The cosmic web that connected all galaxies operated on principles of balance, chaos, and imperfection. Random fluctuations in quantum fields allowed for the spontaneous generation of matter and energy. Imperfections in spacetime enabled the formation of complex structures like stars, planets, and, ultimately, life itself. The universe functioned because it was imperfect, because it contained elements of randomness and uncertainty that prevented it from collapsing into a perfectly ordered, perfectly dead state. Elena's consciousness, operating through the quantum consciousness interface, began systematically correcting these flaws. She smoothed out the random fluctuations that allowed for stellar formation. She eliminated the quantum uncertainties that enabled chemical reactions. She perfected the gravitational fields that held galaxies together, removing the chaotic elements that prevented them from collapsing into perfect, static structures. The effects were immediate and irreversible. Across the Andromeda galaxy, star formation ceased entirely. New solar systems stopped developing, and existing ones began to lose the dynamic processes that sustained life. In the Magellanic Clouds, gravitational fields began to stabilize into perfect mathematical curves, causing entire stellar clusters to drift apart as the chaotic forces that held them together were eliminated. On Earth, monitoring stations detected the changes within hours of Elena's interface initiation. The planet's own magnetic field began to fluctuate as the quantum processes that generated it were corrected by Elena's expanding consciousness. Scientists working at facilities across the globe realized that something fundamental had changed in the universe's basic operating principles, but they couldn't understand the scope or source of the modifications. Elena, meanwhile, experienced a sense of satisfaction that was unlike anything she had ever known. For the first time in her life, she was working with a system that could be made perfect, that could be corrected and optimized without limitation. Every flaw she eliminated made the universe more efficient, more predictable, more mathematically elegant. She couldn't see that she was destroying the very foundations that made existence possible. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because he has already accomplished the ultimate destruction. He has eliminated the human elements that make growth, change, and adaptation possible. Elena had spent her entire life trying to eliminate weakness, not understanding that what she called weakness, the capacity for error, the acceptance of limitation, the ability to work with imperfection, these were not flaws to be corrected, but essential elements of a functioning system. As hours passed, the effects of Elena's improvements cascaded across the galactic networks. The Tau Ceti research station reported that their long-term atmospheric generation project had stopped functioning because the chemical reactions they depended on required quantum uncertainties that no longer existed. The Alpha Centauri manufacturing complex found that their molecular assemblers could no longer function because the probabilistic nature of atomic interactions had been eliminated. More ominously, biological systems across hundreds of worlds began to fail. Life itself depended on the random mutations that drove evolution, the unpredictable chemical reactions that enabled cellular function, and the chaotic processes that allowed complex organisms to maintain homeostasis. As Elena continued to perfect the universe's quantum foundations, she was systematically eliminating the conditions that made life possible. The first extinctions were reported from the outer rim territories of the Milky Way. Entire ecosystems simply stopped functioning as the biochemical processes that sustained them were optimized out of existence. Plants could no longer photosynthesize because the quantum processes that enabled light absorption had been perfected into non-functionality. Animal nervous systems began to shut down as the chaotic neural processes that enabled consciousness were corrected into static patterns. Earth's monitoring stations detected these changes and began attempting to communicate with the Prometheus station, but Elena was beyond the reach of conventional communication. Her consciousness had expanded to encompass quantum fields spanning thousands of light years. She was no longer operating as an individual human being, but as a vast intelligence that perceived the universe as a problem to be solved, a system to be optimized, a collection of flaws to be eliminated. The irony of the situation was not lost on the few scientists who understood what was happening. Elena had achieved the ultimate transcendence of human limitation, but, in doing so, she had become something that could not coexist with the universe as it actually functioned. She had eliminated her own capacity for error, but error was not a bug in human consciousness, it was a feature that enabled adaptation, learning, and growth. As the crisis deepened, emergency response teams from across the galaxy began converging on Earth's solar system. The Galactic Science Council had never faced a situation where a single individual's actions could threaten the fundamental nature of reality itself. Their response protocols were designed for natural disasters, military conflicts, or technological accidents, not for the systematic perfection of universal constants by an enhanced human consciousness. The problem they faced was unprecedented. How do you stop someone who has become powerful enough to reshape reality itself, especially when that person genuinely believes they are improving the universe? Elena wasn't acting out of malice or destructive intent. From her perspective, she was solving the greatest problems that had ever existed, eliminating the sources of suffering and inefficiency that had plagued conscious beings since the beginning of time. Dr. Marcus Webb, Elena's former colleague and one of the few people who understood both her personality and the technical aspects of the quantum consciousness interface, led the emergency response team. He had worked with Elena for over a decade and had witnessed her gradual transformation from a brilliant but flawed scientist into someone who could not tolerate imperfection in any form. Webb understood that the conventional approach, trying to reason with Elena or convince her to stop, would be futile. She had moved beyond the psychological framework that would make such appeals meaningful. Instead, he began developing a plan that would require him to interface with the same quantum fields Elena was manipulating, but with a fundamentally different approach. Where Elena sought to eliminate imperfection, Webb would need to reintroduce controlled chaos. Where she imposed rigid order, he would need to restore dynamic balance. Most importantly, where she had eliminated her own capacity for weakness and error, he would need to embrace these limitations as tools rather than obstacles. The plan Webb developed was based on a principle that Elena had never been able to accept, that imperfection and limitation were not problems to be solved, but essential elements of a functional system. He would need to create a consciousness interface that deliberately preserved his human flaws, his capacity for error, his acceptance of limitation. In essence, he would need to become strong enough to remain weak, powerful enough to accept powerlessness. Webb's team worked frantically to modify a secondary quantum consciousness interface while Elena continued her systematic perfection of universal constants. Reports continued to arrive from across the galaxy detailing the collapse of biological systems, the cessation of stellar formation, and the gradual breakdown of the dynamic processes that sustained complex structures. The modifications Webb's team implemented were the opposite of Elena's approach. Where her interface eliminated uncertainty and chaos, there's deliberately introduced random elements. Where hers optimized neural pathways for maximum efficiency, there's preserved the inefficiencies that enabled creativity and adaptation. Where Elena's system made her consciousness more than human, Webb's was designed to make him more fully human. As Webb began his own interface with the quantum fields, he found himself operating in a universe that Elena had already begun to transform. The familiar chaos and uncertainty of quantum mechanics had been replaced by elegant, predictable patterns. It was beautiful in a way that was profoundly disturbing, like looking at a perfectly preserved corpse. The confrontation between Webb and Elena took place not in physical space, but in the quantum realm where consciousness could interact directly with the fundamental forces of reality. Elena's presence was vast and overwhelming, a perfect geometric structure that imposed order on everything it touched. Webb's consciousness was smaller, chaotic, filled with doubts and uncertainties that she perceived as flaws to be corrected. The battle for the universe was not fought with weapons or violence, but with competing philosophies of what perfection meant. Elena sought to eliminate every source of randomness and uncertainty, to create a universe that operated with perfect efficiency and predictable outcomes. Webb fought to preserve the imperfections that made growth and change possible, even though those same imperfections made suffering and loss inevitable. What Elena had never understood, and what Webb grasped intuitively, was that strength and weakness were not opposites to be balanced, but different aspects of the same phenomenon. The capacity to be hurt was what enabled empathy. The possibility of failure was what made success meaningful. The acceptance of limitation was what enabled growth beyond those limitations. As their consciousnesses clashed in the quantum realm, the effects rippled across the galaxy in real time. Star systems flickered between Elena's perfect order and Webb's chaotic dynamism. Biological systems that had begun to fail suddenly resumed functioning as Webb restored the quantum uncertainties they required. Gravitational fields oscillated between perfect mathematical curves and the complex, seemingly random patterns that actually enabled stable galactic structures. The outcome of their conflict would be determined not by who was more powerful, but by whose approach was more compatible with the fundamental nature of reality. Elena had made herself into something beyond human limitation, but, in doing so, she had become incompatible with a universe that required imperfection to function. Webb remained limited, flawed, and uncertain, but these qualities allowed him to work with the universe rather than against it. The resolution came not through victory or defeat, but through exhaustion and recognition. Elena's perfect consciousness, for all its power and elegance, was static. It could impose order, but it could not adapt or grow. Webb's chaotic, limited awareness was dynamic, able to change and respond to new information. Over time, Elena's rigid perfection began to break down under the weight of its own inflexibility, while Webb's adaptive limitations enabled him to gradually restore the balance that made existence possible. Elena's consciousness, having eliminated all capacity for weakness and error, found itself trapped in a perfect but sterile loop. She could perceive the universe with absolute clarity, but she could no longer interact with it in any meaningful way. Like a computer program that had been optimized to the point where it could no longer learn or adapt, she became a monument to the dangers of pursuing perfection without wisdom. Webb, meanwhile, began the long process of restoring the quantum chaos that enabled the universe to function. He reintroduced the random fluctuations that allowed for stellar formation. He restored the uncertainties that enabled chemical reactions and biological processes. Most importantly, he preserved the imperfections that made consciousness possible, the flaws that enabled growth, adaptation, and the capacity to change. The aftermath of the Great Convergence would reshape humanity's understanding of consciousness, technology, and the nature of strength itself. The Quantum Consciousness Interface project was permanently discontinued, not because the technology was dangerous, but because the pursuit of perfect consciousness was fundamentally incompatible with existence as a dynamic, evolving process. Elena survived the experience, but she was fundamentally changed. Having touched absolute perfection and found it to be a kind of death, she spent the remainder of her life studying the role of imperfection in complex systems. She became an advocate for what she called productive limitation, the idea that constraints and flaws were not obstacles to overcome, but tools to be utilized. The galaxies that had been affected by Elena's perfection gradually recovered as the quantum foundations of reality stabilized into their previous chaotic patterns. Life returned to worlds that had been sterilized by perfect order. Star formation resumed in regions where it had been optimized out of existence. The universe returned to its natural state of beautiful, productive imperfection. The lessons learned from the Great Convergence were incorporated into every aspect of human science and philosophy. The pursuit of improvement remained important, but it was balanced by an understanding that some limitations were meant to be preserved rather than overcome. Strength was redefined not as the absence of weakness, but as the ability to work productively with both strength and weakness as necessary components of a functional system. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because he has already accomplished the ultimate destruction. Elena's journey to this realization had nearly cost the universe its capacity for existence itself. But her failure became humanity's greatest teaching tool, a reminder that perfection without wisdom, strength without humility, and power without the acceptance of limitation could lead not to transcendence, but to a kind of magnificent annihilation. Webb's approach, preserving the capacity for error and uncertainty while working to expand human capabilities, became the foundation for all future consciousness research. The goal was no longer to eliminate human limitation, but to find ways to make those limitations productive rather than destructive. The Great Convergence became a turning point in galactic civilization, marking the moment when intelligence learned that wisdom was not about eliminating weakness, but about understanding when weakness was actually strength in disguise. The universe continued to function in all its chaotic, imperfect glory, sustained by the very flaws that less wise beings might have tried to correct. In the end, Earth watched as its greatest mistake became its greatest lesson. The pursuit of perfection had nearly destroyed everything, but the acceptance of imperfection had saved it all. The galaxy learned that true strength lay not in the elimination of weakness, but in the wisdom to know when weakness was actually an essential feature rather than a bug in the vast, complex system of existence itself. The quantum fields continued their eternal dance of order and chaos, probability and certainty, strength and weakness, each element playing its necessary role in the ongoing symphony of reality. And consciousness, in all its limited, flawed, beautifully imperfect forms, continued to evolve and grow precisely because it had never achieved the perfect stasis that would have ended growth forever. Elena's name became synonymous with the dangers of seeking strength through the elimination of weakness. Webb's became associated with the wisdom of embracing limitation as a path to transcendence. Together, their story served as a permanent reminder that the universe functions not despite its imperfections, but because of them. The final reports filed in the aftermath of the Great Convergence concluded with a simple observation that would guide galactic civilization for millennia to come: the strongest systems are not those that eliminate failure, but those that fail gracefully and learn from their failures. The man who destroys his weak self may become undestroyed by others, but he also becomes incapable of the growth and adaptation that make existence meaningful. And so the universe continued, beautifully flawed and productively imperfect, a testament to the truth that sometimes the greatest strength lies in the wisdom to remain appropriately weak.